So, today's lesson's on Timothy. Now, if you remember basics of Timothy, oops, this thing's broken now, okay. Were Timothy's parents Christians? I know. Pop quiz, that's right, a Jew and a Greek, okay. So his father was Greek, okay. His mother and grandmother trained him in like, and so he would have been what was referred to as a mumser, okay. To get across basically what that is, it's what we would call a bastard, okay. And by that, they were talking about that from a religious perspective, all right. So Timothy was sort of on the outside of Jewish culture looking in. He would not have been someone who had been picked up by a rabbi to be trained because of that background in life. But yet he became a Christian, and he was a great asset to the church, and Paul's reaching out to him, and Paul is giving him guidance in terms of, here's how you're going to work this divide that you are very familiar with. You've got a foot in these two worlds, and we have Jews, we have new Greek Christians, etc., and here's how I'm going to give you insight in terms of how to guide the church, okay? So I give you that background to give an idea to say that just like us today, that sometimes we feel like we are living in a discordant culture, that the culture we may have grown up in has been changing. We're now in a post-Christian nation and the like, and so we feel like we've got to navigate different aspects of this. And so Timothy is a very applied book in this way. Now, we're going to go back through some history lessons here. Remember Enron? Yeah, back in the early 2000s, what we would call yesterday and what our college students say is ancient history, because it was before they were born, and I'm going, okay, this is really hit me. But in Enron, this is a book, The Smartest Guys in the Room, The Amazing Story of Enron's Collapse. And basically, what the whole idea was is these were incredibly educated, intelligent people who believed the rules didn't apply to them. And that's how it all fell apart. That the rules didn't apply to them because they were the smart guys in the room. If you remember, the CFO, the president, the CEO were all indicted. All did jail time. Ken Lay himself died, actually, from this. Also around the same time, Martha Stewart. Now, I know Martha Stewart's had a resurgence lately with Snoop Dogg and, cookbooks, and you've lived an interesting life when you're sitting there going, it's like the Olympics. I started teaching when Snoop Dogg came out with his first album. And, he was a gangster rapper, and I'm going, how did he suddenly become America's grandpa on the Olympics? But, I mean, he's meeting with everybody and all this. I'm like, it's an incredible world we live in and how this stuff goes. But Martha Stewart, in the early 2000s, ended up doing jail because she didn't submit to the law. And ironically, the prosecutors offered her, just pay this fine, no jail time, and she refused. She refused to admit she had done anything wrong. And so she did jail time. At the beginning of this country, two groups of people came here when the country was being settled and first started up. One were groups of people who thought about setting up a new country, a new area would be a shining city on a hill. These people were driven by religious values and an idea of changing the world. The other groups of people were people who came here because there's no rules and I get to do what I want. And that's who populated this country. By the way, that's who populated Texas. Okay? I make fun of my wife and I, and when we go to the Alamo and, you see all the flags, and the flag with the number 1 of the deaths there were Tennesseans, not Texans, because the Texans ran. Okay? But the other point that for sake of full honesty, the reason those Tennesseans didn't run is they were wanted for things like murder and things of this sort. And they had come to Texas because, hey, woo-hoo, nobody can get us here. And it's like, we might as well do something here while we're here. That's the country. And ironically, we see that reflected in our lives today, culturally. There's two groups. Groups are saying, we can build a better country and be a light. And a group saying, no rules at all. Just let me do what I want. That's what I want. And so we see that. Now, these two ideas have been in conflict, and we see it in a lot of different ways. We see this in that great comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes, and I don't know if this is very clear. The first side says, Calvin says, I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not. And Hobbes shoves him down on the ground. And Calvin says, why'd you do that? And Hobbes says, you were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means. And Calvin says, I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. And that basically summarizes the culture we live in. Okay? Now, the executives in Enron refused to submit to the rules and accounting of the laws of the land. Martha Stewart refused to submit to the rules of trading and later the laws of the land. During COVID, Americans didn't want to submit to anything, going through this. Because we as Americans have a problem submitting. We're Americans, by George, and we are free. What sent Jesus to the cross? I know these are all theological answers, but I'm on a much more practical basis. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is struggling with what he knows is going to happen. He's human. What sent him to the cross? Jesus did not pray. He said, Father, let this cup of anguish pass from me, but because I love all these people, I will go. That's not what he said. Jesus did show love. I'm not saying he didn't. He showed forgiveness on the cross. But what he said was, Father, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. What sent Jesus to the cross was not love, it was submission. We're Americans and we don't like that word. But that's what sent Jesus to the cross, was submission. Jesus submitted to God's will. So the question for us is, what is God's will? Luckily, you don't have to research this for the test because they gave us cheat sheets. He made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his kind intention, which he purposed in him, with a view to an administration suitable to the fullness of times. That is, the summing up of all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on this earth. His will is for everything in our lives, everyone's lives, to be summed up in Christ, to live the example that he set for us. Philippians 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Oh, that's tough. The Olympics are incredible, okay? And especially for someone like me whose athletic ability ranked between 0 and non-existent, it is always fascinating to watch what these people can. But I watched one athlete being interviewed, and they were asked, what's their approach to this and the like, and they said, well, I just try and stay humble, but now it's time for me to just go out there and get what I want. And I thought about that sentence, and I'm like, that pretty much summarizes America right there. Because it's like one of those things is, once you know that you're humble, you aren't anymore, are you? So, anyway, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Ouch, there it goes against American culture right there. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. There it is. What example did he set for us? When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth. No servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. To quote that master theologian Yoda, do or do not. There is no try. Now, granted, we can't be perfect. Okay. Granted, there is no perfection, and that is why Christ died for us. But this verse is very clear. Having the right mindset, well, I mean to do this, doesn't actually reflect whether you have the faith or not. If you have the faith, you will actually do these things. And why? Because it applies not to us just spiritually, in terms of preparing us for heaven, but it applies for us on this earth too. There are realities here on earth. James 1, 22 and 25. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. Now, are we talking here by salvation by works? Nope. There's nothing we can do that can get us to heaven. Okay? Any of you who've been in the military, you can sit there and say, I want to be a Marine. But if you're at boot camp and don't do what your drill instructor tells you to do, you're not going to be a Marine. Okay? It doesn't matter if you identify as a Marine today. You know, if you don't do the marches and if you don't salute and if you don't do exactly what they tell you, you're gone. Right? Same thing applies to us. Now, everything flows from that big picture of God's will. And now we're going to take it and come down to practical issues. Jesus submitted to God, 1 Peter 1. Christians submit to Jesus, 1 Peter 1. Any disagreements so far? Okay, we're going there, okay? Christians submit to the government, 1 Peter 2. People are starting to get a little... Slaves submit to their masters. And by the way, we'll get into this. Slavery at this time was you indentured yourself if you had debts, things of this sort. There was slavery in terms of if the Romans conquered different countries and put them like. But one of the things, and this can be a different lesson for us at some point in time, the slavery we're familiar with in the United States, there are very specific passages that would speak directly against that. In fact, little known history, slave owners in the South, they wanted to, quote, educate their slaves, but they had edited Bibles that they would provide for the slaves that had been removed out of that anything, like God's commandments on slavery and the like, because they didn't want to give the slaves the wrong ideas. Okay? Wives submit to husbands. Husbands submit to wives. It's always hilarious going down to, when it's government, it's like, and then we get to that one, and everybody is very rigidly set and not moving and not looking at their spouse beside them. Young submit to the old. Throw this one out here. Some of you are old enough to remember the old days. When I was a kid, when you had family gatherings, who ate first? The older people. Yep, the adults. Who served the adults? The children. When did the children eat? After the adults were fed. Who eats first now? I just want to throw this out. The dogs. Okay, all right, let's see. Okay, but you see how culture shift. Just other little things that shift. Back in the 50s and 60s, if a woman was working outside the home, she was referred to as a working wife. What is she referred to now? A working mother. You notice what the focus is on? Just throw that out there. To say the focus on family life in our culture today is children first, children first, children first. That's not the way it's supposed to be. You see this hierarchy? Your spouses come before the kids. How key is this concept of submission? Our submission to our spouses, our elders, and the government is a prerequisite and requirement for our submission to God. Does this mean as Americans we can't disagree with the government? No, because this is our structure here. We get to vote. We get to speak out. Okay? But we also don't get to pick and choose what laws we will or will not adhere to, unless, of course, they contradict God's laws. Okay? 1 Timothy 1, 18 and 20. Timothy, my son. By the way, given the background, what I told you on Timothy, how do you think he felt reading this? Timothy, my son. Somebody now. I give you this instruction, holding on to faith and a good conscience. Some have rejected these and so have shipwrecked their faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, who I'm handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. Apparently, they had not submitted to God's will, and the church had to discipline them. And in Titus, which is Paul also giving some guidance there, he said, warn a divisive person once, and then warn him a second time. After that, have nothing to do with him. You may be sure that such a man is warped and sinful. He's self-condemned. Think about that the next time you're getting in major arguments on things. 1 Timothy 2, I urge you, first of all, that request, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Remember who he's writing to here? This is the Roman government. It's not representative democracy. They ruled by power, by fear, by diktat, and yet God commanded Christians to pray for them. Now, of course, we can always pray that prayer such as, for those of you who saw Fiddler on the Roof, and they're scene where it comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, is there a proper prayer for the Tsar? And the rabbi goes, may the Lord bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. Okay? Notice that our submission to the government is tied into God's plan of salvation. Remember the second rule we've caught on before. There's some things that work well in theory, but then there's the reality of life on earth. And as an academic, I live with that every day. Reading all sorts of paper, the theoretical, and I'm going, yeah, I don't see how that's going to work. And it doesn't. In other words, there's theory and then there's reality. So 1 Timothy 2 and verse 8. I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. Why did Paul talk to men specifically and not women about anger and arguing? It's before women could vote? Oh, here we go. All right. In general, again, we're not talking about specific individuals, but I'm talking about in general. Who tends to have a bigger problem with anger, men or women? I know everybody's afraid. Let me put it to you this way. In general, when men get upset, what do? They get angry. When women get upset, what do? Plan revenge. You know, having taught this class for 24 years and getting these statements from people, it's like, oh, wait a minute, 20 years ago, we were sitting here talking and said, okay, it's good to see that, you know, all our discussions and teaching have fallen on deaf ears. No. Men and women respond differently emotionally. Okay? To a certain extent. Yep. Okay, I've told you a joke that once the girls hit upper elementary school and intermediate school, I spent most of the day trying to figure out who was crying and whether it was a happy cry or a sad cry. Because, women know there's differences, but guys, we can't hear this. We're just crying bad, okay? Yes, sir. Please, okay. What I said, in general, what do men do when they get upset? They said, get angry. I said, in general, what do women do when they get upset? And one of our colleagues said, plan revenge, okay? And that's what I was laughing about. Okay, and here's... Testosterone versus estrogen. And I said, in general, that has aspects of this. But the catch is, there's a reason why Paul stated this specifically to men. Men, we need to get in control of our anger. Okay? It'll be our undoing. When it comes to submission, men in general have more difficulty dealing with anger and arguments than women. Women will discuss things. Guys, do we want to discuss all the details? No, we want to get to the solution. Okay, here it is, going through. Okay? And I've heard it said, in general, that women, in terms of discussion, what men have to learn is women don't necessarily say what they're thinking, they say what they're feeling. And that allows them to work through this. And if we as men don't talk through this with them, okay, we're not allowing them to work through that and us help them. Okay? And so when we want to just get upset and angry, we're short-circuiting that process. Now, granted, there's a time and place for everything, okay? And individuals are different, and that's what part of being married and growing together is. But in 1 Timothy 2:9, I throw this out because it has become a joke in this class. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. It's not this slide, it's the next slide. Why did Paul talk to women specifically, not men, about dressing with modesty and decency? Because men shop at Costco. That's right, most of the problems with men is we have style. We have the same style that was popular when we were about 19 years old, okay? And I still remember during the PhD program, Gretchen walked in one day. We had Shamron, and she goes, "We're going shopping." And I'm like, "Why?" "To get you some clothes." And we're at the mall, and it's one of these men's stores, and there's two teenage girls sitting out the front because nobody else was there, and they're just sitting there talking, and they saw us coming. And I saw one of them jab the other one and point at us. And you could see him saying, "We're going to make quota today." Okay? Because it came in, I'm in the dressing room, and Gretchen's throwing stuff, and they're going, "We think he'd like this and this," and things are just coming over there, and I'm going, whatever, just, can I get out of here? Just let me pay and just go. All right? So men, we're not the ones sitting here going, "Ooh, how can I dress differently?" This doesn't even come into our mind. Now, when it comes to submission, women in general have more difficulty dealing with these, albeit, queer eye for the straight guy, metrosexuals, man buns, and all the rest. Okay, this is the one I was talking about. For those of you who've been here about 20 years, in 2001, when I was first asked to teach in this class with Dave and Doug, if you'll remember, they were getting through stuff, and Dave was teaching, and I'm like, "Hurry up. You are not going to give me women's role in the church, my first lesson here." And kept going. I'm like, "Move it." And he just smiled and said, "I think we'll leave this till next week." And it's been a bizarre thing, but I've been here for 23 years now. And at the end of summer, I don't know who does these schedulings, but we hit this, and somehow I'm teaching. And this is just a one-off. I was asked to fill in, and I'm just wondering if the eldership isn't just planning this and setting me up, periodically every 4 years. But here we are once again. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be kept safe through childbirth if they continue in love, faith, and holiness with propriety. We can't ignore these verses and just say they were cultural. If all we had was 1 Corinthians, we could argue that. But Timothy, he's writing to Timothy, who's dealing with multiple churches, and he ties it into something that was earlier, creation. And second, before men jump on the macho express, remember that the church is the bride of Christ, so as members of the church, we are all wise to Christ. But given that, why would God have passed on these instructions to us? Okay? A couple ideas to consider. God required that men should provide the spiritual leadership because if he didn't, men wouldn't do it. Okay? More women are involved in churches than men. And I thought this for a while, and now there's actually data to back it up. If men aren't involved in church in some way, shape, or form, they don't attend. And men have a propensity to say, fine, you do the church thing. Great. You take over. I don't care. Okay? So it's not so much that women can't lead, but go back and look at Deborah in the Old Testament and the like. That the leader of Israel, God told him, go and attack your enemies. And he said, okay, but I'm scared. I want her to go with me. I need mommy. And the reason I say that is I've got potential PhD students showing up for interviews with their mom and dad in tow. Last time that happened, we got done, and this lady had incredible scores and all this, and the other faculty looked at me and said, what do you think? I said, we're not letting her in. And they just laughed, and they said, why not? I said, if she had to have mommy and daddy here at 25 years old, she can't make this, because mommy and daddy ain't going to be here the whole time. Okay? And so it's the same thing. When he said, I'm scared, ever come with me? He said, okay, but you're not going to have the victory. A woman will, because you just can't man up. And the data shows this. Gentlemen, we tend to blow off our responsibilities unless we're required to do it. Okay? Second idea. Oh, and before we get in this, men, remember that with leadership comes responsibility. The example used was that Eve sinned first. Okay? But in sermons where it points out that Eve sins first, they tend to forget something. When God showed up, did he call Eve? Who did he call? Okay, Adam, what's going on? Because, by the way, if you go back and read that, it says the serpent tempted Eve, and she took the fruit, and she ate it, and she turned around and gave it to Adam. So where had Adam been this whole time? Right there. And what had Adam done? Absolutely nothing. Hence, point one. He's like, I just want to stay out of an argument. I know God told me this, and I just passed this on to her, but I'm going to let her do this even though I know God told me, don't do this. Idea two, there may be actually something behind the idea of traditional roles. My wife is a physician. She graduated top of her medical school class. Her and her best friend, who also graduated top of this residency class, did they go on to become cardiothoracic surgeons? No. There are far more female physicians than male physicians out there. Have been since the 80s. And the majority of female physicians take primary care jobs, pediatrics, internal medicine. Why? Because they want to be mothers and have some time around the house. And they know that if you're a cardiothoracic surgeon, you don't have time anywhere. I do research with the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Texas Health Resources. In our first meeting, we were supposed to have dinner. I was there at 6 o'clock. His nurse had texted me saying there's a surgery that's gone longer. I said, okay. He showed up at 9. He said, I didn't figure you'd be here. I said, yeah. He said, so why should we give you the data? We're going to give it to Duke Medical Center. I said, Duke, they'll do that great. They'll do the analysis just as well as we will. He said, so why should we give it to you? And I just looked at him and smiled and said, would Duke have waited 3 hours? And he said, you have the data. Okay? There's realities out there. Okay? In In 2002, the American Heart Association, after studying 4,000 men and women over 10 years, found the following. And this was not what they were looking for. They were actually studying something else. And as an empirical researcher, this is when I say this is the stuff you love, when it's not something you're expecting, so there's no implicit bias ahead of time. Because what do I mean by that? From the moment we got married, my wife started clipping out articles and giving them to me about how dark chocolate was good for you. And I always pointed out that this research was always done by female physicians. And that if you look at the research that says beer is good for you, this is all done by male researchers. This is what we call a priori bias, okay? But here, the American Heart Association was not looking at this. And what they did was they found these were medical people they were studying, okay? Medical people, 10,000 of them, or 4,000 of them. Those who defy traditional societal roles suffer more health consequences such as heart disease than those adhere to traditional roles. The researchers took into account such factors as smoking, age, anxiety, stress, household responsibilities, blood pressure, weight, cholesterol level, diabetes, everything they could throw at it. And all things being equal, this is what they found. The investigators did not find that high amounts of job stress, characterized as having high demands with little autonomy, was associated with an increased risk of heart disease. However, they did find that women who were in these positions of high authority, high job demands, suffered higher rates of heart disease than other women, although their male counterparts did not. Similarly, men who dubbed themselves primarily as house husbands, about 10% of the participants, had an 82% higher 10-year death rate than men who worked outside the home. When I was completing my PhD thesis, Gretchen was working, I'm at home, we have a two-year-old and a newborn. Lisa was extremely colicky. By extremely colicky, I mean she screamed night and day, all the time. And the only thing that would calm her was breastfeeding, an option unavailable to me. Okay? I will tell you that from personal experience, that 82% higher 10-year death rate, I think that's low. Very, very low. Okay? Does this mean that women should be barefoot and pregnant? Absolutely not. Or never work? Nope. But it also means that even though our culture has told us one thing, our bodies may be saying another, and perhaps God knows this since He created us. And so here's this study by Yale, first done in 2008, updated in 2017. And we don't have time to have this discussion, but I'd love to have this discussion sometimes with the women's group because you are old enough to have seen this and experienced it yourself. Okay? By many objective measures, the lives of women in the U.S. have improved over the past 35 years. Yet we show, and by the way, these two professors at Wharton are a married couple. Okay? We show that measures of subjective well-being indicate that women's happiness has declined both absolutely and relative to men. The paradox of women's declining relative well-being is found across various data sets. Measures of subjective well-being and is pervasive across demographic groups in industrialized countries. No matter where they looked, they found the same thing. Relative declines in female happiness have eroded a gender gap in happiness in which women in the 1970s typically reported higher subjective well-being than did men. These declines have continued, and a new gender gap is emerging, one with high subjective well-being for men and less for women. And this doesn't even bring into the fact of the negative effects of social media, much more prevalent on women than men, or young women than young men. Okay? This is the data. These are not Christians. These are married researchers saying every data set we look at, same thing. Something's going on. Interesting enough, also research shows this, expectations management. And perhaps this gets back into facts of men and women and how we view things. Performing household chores makes men statistically less likely to become depressed, but contributes to depression in women. That's what the data shows, okay? And the best explanation for the researchers published this was, taking on housework seems to encourage men to judge themselves as generally likable, fair-minded dudes, kindly reducing their wives' load. Okay? So, gentlemen, keep doing housework. On the other hand, taking on housework seems to make women feel exploited and depressed. Again, I'd love to have this conversation with y'all sometime, okay? But this is what the researchers stated. I just found it humorous. The statement was, why does this taking on housework seem to make the women feel exploited? Because they don't like the way we husbands are doing it. Gretchen was gone one weekend, and I thought, I'm going to be a good husband. And I cleaned the house. And by cleaned, I don't mean my definition of clean. I meant cleaned more than I'd ever cleaned anything in my freaking life. I mean, I thought, this place is spotless. This is incredible. She walked in the door, looked around, and said, oh, thanks for picking up. Ask me if I ever did that again. Because I was like, I ain't doing this, okay? Okay. Why is submitting to spiritual authority important? 1 Timothy 4:1. The Spirit clearly says that in the latter times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. It's for our own protection. Submission isn't popular in our culture, but it's our own protection. Why do we have elders? Why do we have other people we should be reaching out to hold us accountable and the like? Well, think of it as someone to set the bar. We tend to get lazy. What we need is a coach. Any of you played sports? And even though I had no athletic ability, I played sports because I was a glutton for punishment. But you know, what did coaches do? They pushed you when you didn't want to do anything, when you were exhausted. Okay? And when you lost that first game, remember the coach coming in late and we knew we were doomed because he walked in late and he said, gentlemen, you lost. Do you know what losers feel? They feel pain. And so we ran suicide for 2 hours, and then we ran up and down this hill until we were crawling up the hill, and he stood at the top of the hill, and we had to come up to the top of the hill and touch his feet. And as we touched his feet, he'd go, remember this the next time you're losing. And we're like, okay. Guess what? We didn't lose. Okay? For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Command and teach these things. Set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. Be diligent in these matters. Give yourself wholly to them so that everyone may see your progress. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in this, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. And why do we need this coaching? Because we need this guidance. Let me say this. As I said, when we're talking about this stuff in Scripture, we're talking about generalities. And so am I saying, for example, that women can't work outside the home or anything? Absolutely not. You know, the reason I went and got a PhD is that, to be perfectly blunt, I hadn't planned on marrying a doctor. Okay? And so she could cut back to half-time. But as I was talking to one of the executives at Bell South, who's an elder, and I was struggling with this, I said, you know, I always thought my wife would stay at home and raise the kids, and now, you know, I'm married to someone who's running public health clinics, and I'm faced with a verse that says, pure religion and undefiled before the Father is this, to help the widows and the orphans in their affliction and keep oneself unspotted for the world. He goes, yeah, that's right. So you can't stay here, even though you're about to make vice president, because you got to do what's best for your family. And we didn't want to use daycare. So it meant I had to have something where I would be home half the time. Okay? So there's multiple ways to do this. The catch is we have to put our families first, not our ambitions and the like. And to do that, we have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to come in. When we first placed membership here and I met with the elders, the first thing I asked them is, what is the biggest problems I need to fear raising a family here in Dallas? And Richard Schwarb immediately responded, Metro Madness. He said, you were going to get involved in too many activities, and to get anywhere in this place requires an hour. So you're going to spend all your time driving, and you're going to be exhausted, and you won't have any time for family. And I always appreciated that guidance. We limited the kids to 2 activities a year, and even then we felt like we were run ragged. I don't see how people do more than that. But the catch is we have to hold each other accountable so we can do this. Are individual people capable of doing incredible things? Absolutely. One of my heroes is Margaret Thatcher. And I love the great line she had that when the Falkland Islands were invaded and she was meeting with her cabinet, and the cabinet, the military advisor said, we can't take the Falklands. And in fact, President Reagan had sent Secretary Haig to go and said, don't think you can take the islands either. And she's meeting all this, and she looks around and says, I don't think you people understand. Those are British citizens. We are going to take those islands, we are going to win this war, and we're going to retrieve our citizens. And this is not open for discussion. The decision has been made. And the steward comes in, and he said, Madam Prime Minister, it's time for lunch. What would you like? She said, I would like steak. And he said, and the vegetables? And she looks around and he says, the vegetables will all have steak as well. And I was like, I like it. Okay, I got to keep that one, okay? But the catch is, we have to have these guidelines. We have to have people holding us accountable, or else we will tend to selfishness, ambition, disputes, all the things we've already read about. The sheer difficulty of following Jesus is a barrier we face as Christians. We don't want to talk about that. Jesus' love is it. Jesus was very particular. Jesus did not take a marketing class. Because he came to people and he said, follow me. Well, I need to bury my father. Let the dead bury the dead. Follow me. He's like, I'm not going to make this easy for you. You have to choose. Going to class, these aren't exactly marathon performances we ask people to do. But following Jesus, that's quite different. G.K. Chesterton had a quote I love, which is, Christianity has not so much been tried and found wanting, it's been found difficult and not tried. To put others before yourself is difficult in our culture. To submit is difficult in our culture. To love when they are not responding to you in love is difficult in our culture. It is much easier to bring Jesus into one of our churches, dress him up, and tone him down than it is to counter the Jesus of the Gospels and seek to follow him. So, this is what Paul told Timothy in a bifurcated culture that Timothy was growing up in, and it still applies to us today. So, that was the second bell, so it's time to let y'all go. No, it wasn't the second bell? Oh, then I actually got done early. Well, then I need to let you go to make up for all the times I kept you late. All right.